Hello, everyone, and welcome to our seminar today. I'm Vanessa Weisbrod, the Executive Director of the Celiac Disease Program at Children's National Hospital. And today we are going to be talking about supporting the educational and social development of children with celiac disease. I just want to take a moment to start off by thanking you for coming today. We spend every day of our work weeks working with patients and families living with celiac disease, and we just are incredibly grateful that you've taken the time out of your day to learn about celiac disease and the gluten-free diet and how you can take some very simple steps to help kids with celiac disease succeed in a learning environment. So there are several things that we're going to go through. We're going to talk about celiac disease, the requirements for managing the gluten-free diet, talk about how celiac disease impacts learning and social emotional development, and then talk about some reasonable accommodations to expect for a child with celiac disease in a learning environment or a school-sponsored activity, and how federal laws apply to those children. So there are several handouts that you'll see attached to today's seminar. We're going to talk through all of them. I'm not going to go into great detail about them, but as we go through the course, I will point them out to you, and be sure to download them at the end. So I want to start today by talking about why some parents react very extremely about gluten at school. So very often we get calls from schools saying, why are these gluten-free parents so crazy? And so I just want to help us all take a step back and talk about why parents feel so protective about their kids with celiac disease. So this is one family from our celiac disease program. This is Brandon's story. He's a child with celiac disease. At 11 weeks old, he started vomiting blood and losing weight. His mother, who already had a diagnosis of celiac disease for herself, was already on a gluten-free diet, but at that point she was put on a dairy, soy, and nut-free diet until 12 months when she stopped breastfeeding Brandon. At that point, Brandon was too young to test for celiac disease since he wasn't eating gluten yet. So over the years, they kept watching him. He developed severe anemia, low platelet counts, rashes with no explanation. He had 3 hospital stays and ongoing GI issues until he was 3 years old when things got very bad and he lost about 4 pounds in 2 weeks. And this is all while eating gluten. At that point, his celiac blood test was positive, and these are just a few pictures that his family has allowed us to share with you of his time in the hospital. As you can see, no parent wants to see their child in this situation, and no one wants to be in the hospital with their child who is not feeling well and is not growing. So then they get that diagnosis. It's such a relief to know that there's a cause to all of these symptoms, and then it can be treated and fixed by just a gluten-free diet. But then they walk out of the medical center or the hospital into the world, and they realize that gluten is everywhere. Just think about what you ate this morning. Was there gluten in it? Did you have a piece of toast or a bagel or a donut maybe at Dunkin' Donuts on the way into work? It's gluten is all over the place. And mom and dad go into this very protective mode where they have to keep that toxin out of there that has been destroying their lives for so many years. To them, that gluten is what put their child in the hospital and made them go through so much pain. So that's why they feel that way. And I just want everybody to remember that when we start talking about a child with celiac disease, that when that parent comes to you and says, my child needs support and accommodations, it's not just because they think that gluten-free diets are cool. It's that they've probably been through a really long road to get to this point. So let's talk now about what is celiac disease. So celiac is a genetic autoimmune disorder that causes damage to the villi of the small intestines. So the villi in your gut are they look like fingers, and they're what pull in nutrients from food. And when you have celiac disease and you're eating gluten, those villi become damaged and they can no longer absorb the nutrition that you see in food. So it can cause lots and lots of problems. So the damage is caused by the protein, which is found in wheat, rye, and barley. The body sees this gluten as something that is unsafe, and it begins to send help to get rid of it. And then they produce T cells, and it attacks the body, and that's when the damage occurs. So there are lots and lots of symptoms in children with celiac disease. Children will not have all of these symptoms. Some might just have one, some might have several, and some might have none of these at all. But these are just some of the more common ones that we see in children. So now what happens in the gut? So I know that looking at slides of the gut and cells are not the thing that you guys are used to doing every day, but I think that this graphic really helps to illustrate what's happened to a child with celiac disease. So if you're looking at the left where you see 0, 1, and 2, you see these villi that are very tall and they're pulling in nutrients from the food that the kids are eating, and it's getting brought into the body and it's used to help them grow stronger. But when you get to level 3, which is where a child with celiac disease is, you can see that the villi in their gut are completely shortened and they're flattened. And so they can no longer absorb that really important nutrition from food. And so that's when they start getting sick and having lots of symptoms and stop growing. They might become anemic. All those things start happening when they get to this level, which is why it's so important that they stick to a gluten-free diet so that the villi can repair themselves and heal, and then they can go on to absorb nutrition normally. So, as I said, when the body is not nourished correctly, lots of different symptoms can start, and it can also lead to a lot of other autoimmune diseases, and it can really decrease the quality of life for these children and their families. Left untreated, celiac disease can cause injury to almost every system of the body, the skeletal with having weaker bones, reproductive system. Just think in a female, if a woman can't absorb nutrition into her own body, the baby can't either. Neurological issues, dermatological issues, there's just so many. There's actually over 300 symptoms that they've related to celiac disease. The good news and the bad news is that the only treatment for celiac disease is a strict gluten-free diet. I say this is good and bad news because on the one hand, by changing one's diet, their body can heal and they can become completely healthy again. The bad news is that it's the only treatment, and so we have to be very strict about it. There are no medications, there are no pills or injections or surgeries to cure celiac disease. So the only way to treat this condition is with a strict gluten-free diet. So let's now move on and talking about celiac disease at school. I'm going to give you a few scenarios of things that we hear regularly from parents. My son asked to go to the bathroom 3 times. The teacher kept saying no because he had already used the bathroom pass during that class period. A few minutes later, he had diarrhea in his pants and was so embarrassed that he doesn't want to go back to school. We get these calls all the time. With a very, very simple understanding of what celiac disease is, these teachers would have known that a child with celiac likely isn't going to abuse a bathroom pass, but if they say they have to go, they probably have to go. My 6th grader was told he had an excused absence from the class outdoor education trip because they don't accommodate gluten-free diets at the campsite. He goes to a public school. Is this legal? I don't want him to miss out. This is definitely not legal. This is a public school system, so the child is entitled to a 504 plan to provide accommodations. The school is required to provide gluten-free meals on these trips. So in this particular case, it took our program many, many, many meetings. We had to go as far as the Conflict and Resolution Office for the district and file a complaint with the Americans with Disabilities group in order to get this changed. But in the end, the school district did accommodate the gluten-free diet and have since then changed all of their policies to accommodate children, not just on gluten-free diets, but on lots of other special diets for food allergies or kosher, other religious needs. So we're really happy that we were able to make those changes. Let's talk a little bit in general about celiac at school. As you know, it's a genetic autoimmune condition that affects about 1 in 100 children in the United States, meaning that it's actually one of the most common conditions in children. There are about 74 million school-age children in the United States, thus about 740,000 school-age children are living with celiac disease in our country. And about 49% of them also suffer from anxiety, including separation and social anxiety, pessimism, and excessive worrying. Celiac disease affects learning in many different ways. I'm going to talk about several ways in which it affects learning that I think is really important for educators to understand. Physical and emotional symptoms obviously affect learning, especially when symptoms are anxiety provoking, embarrassing, painful, and distracting. As a result of these symptoms, like that child I spoke about who had diarrhea in his pants at school, or even just those fears of becoming ill at school, students are often unable or unwilling to attend school, which is just a really awful situation. These physical and emotional symptoms negatively impact a student's ability to focus and learn and perform at their usual level. Just think about a time when you had food poisoning or the flu and your stomach was just gurgling and rolling and just hurting so bad, and all you could think about is running to the bathroom. Imagine feeling that way every time you eat something with gluten in it and having to sit in class and try and focus. It's just impossible for a child to be able to focus and to participate fully when they're feeling that way. Exclusion and bullying is a real thing with celiac disease. When children are not accommodated appropriately, the gluten-free diet interferes with academic and social activities and can leave them feeling excluded and extremely isolated. Being left out can also interfere with academic and social and emotional development in these kids. And in some cases, these students attract negative attention from others by eating different foods, asking a lot of questions about the safety of food, or having symptoms in a public environment. Oftentimes, students also experience teasing or taunting, harassment, or bullying by their peers or their teachers. But unfortunately, what we see is that it more often happens by other adults and most often parents of other children in their class who are annoyed or who don't feel that they should have to accommodate this gluten-free diet. So these are all things that parents and children and learning environment staff and educators must consider as they develop plans to manage children in their environment with celiac disease. It is just so important to remember that these exposures to gluten affect their ability to learn. The good news is that it is possible for a child with celiac disease to participate in every activity in a school environment. There are lots of simple modifications that we're going to talk about through this lecture to help you see how easy it is to accommodate a child in a classroom. Our program has been doing these trainings and working with families in schools and school districts all over the United States for the last 11 years. And there has never been a time when we were unable to find an accommodation that would allow a child to successfully participate. So we're going to talk now about the celiac disease management plan. This stems from our Celiac School Action Guidelines for Education program. These are the first national recommendations that were approved for the management of celiac disease in the school setting. These recommendations came about when a group of 44 experts came together to develop recommendations for kids with celiac disease at school. On July 22nd, 2019, this group of experts adopted voluntary recommendations that were informed by evidence-based research, clinicians from 10 pediatric hospitals, education professionals, legal experts, and affected persons and families. The recommendations that we're going to talk about are applicable in a wide range of learning environments, such as home-based childcare, schools, and other facilities that do and do not receive federal funding. So these recommendations will work in a private school, they'll work in daycare centers, and lots of different places, not just those that receive federal dollars. The final recommendations that we're going to see today are aligned with the format and level of detail in other guidelines for chronic diseases like food allergy, diabetes, and asthma. So I'm hoping that you'll be very familiar with what these look like already. And most of the terms are common terms and relevant practices, such as around sanitation, that came from these existing resources. So it's not earth-shatteringly different for food allergy or asthma or diabetes than it is for celiac disease in regards to some practices. And this is just a lovely picture of the group that worked together to create these recommendations. So the celiac disease management plan has 4 key sections in it. start though by talking about the purpose. So these recommendations are intended for the use to develop an individual 504 plan for a child with celiac disease. Yet they could also be helpful for other children with a medical diagnosis from a physician that requires a gluten-free diet. So the intention of what I'm going to talk about is for children with celiac disease, but you may have children who come in with non-celiac gluten sensitivity or a wheat allergy or conditions like autism or Asperger's that their physicians are asking them to be on a gluten-free diet for, and they would also be applicable in those situations. So section 1 looks at formal professional development on celiac disease for professionals who work with children with celiac disease in learning environments. Section 2 looks at educating children and family members about celiac disease. Section 3 looks at ensuring the daily management of celiac. And section 4 looks at developing plans for gluten exposure. Now, it's important to know that these recommendations were developed to be applicable in any 504 plan or accommodation plan, depending on if it's a public or private school. However, they would also be useful for institutions that do not use the standard 504 plan. So in some private institutions, they have a medical plan or they have a special education plan. So all of these would be useful in those plans if they're being developed to accommodate children with celiac disease. So today is what we would consider section 1. This is your formal professional development on celiac disease. So we're going to continue to dive right in. So the purpose of section 1 was to provide in-depth training resources for professionals who work with kids with celiac disease. So there are lots of different things that we're going to cover. We've already talked about what celiac disease is, so we're going to jump right into the gluten-free diet. So as you know, the gluten-free diet is the only treatment that's currently available for celiac disease. There are medications and other therapies currently under investigation, but to date there are no drugs, vaccines, or supplements to treat celiac disease. So what is gluten? Gluten is the protein found in all forms of wheat, rye, and barley, and children or anybody with celiac disease cannot eat these things. It's most commonly found in food, but it's also used in medications, vitamins, cosmetics, shampoos, conditioners, and many school supplies. There is the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which was signed into law in 2004 and implemented in 2006. This is a great labeling law that helps it be easier to identify wheat. The law actually covers milk, eggs, wheat, fish, shellfish, peanuts, tree nuts, and soy. So that wheat is in there for celiac disease, and it requires that the allergen ingredients appear in plain English so that it's easy to identify them. So these are a few different ways that it could look. In the ingredients, it could say flour with wheat in parentheses. There could be a contains wheat statement, or it could be in the additives. So for glucose syrup, for example, in parentheses, wheat. But the really important thing to note here is that this law does not cover rye and barley. So rye and barley will never be listed out on the contains or in the allergen statement. You'll always have to read the label to find them. This is just an example of a food label. So as you'll see in the top ingredients, it says whole grain wheat. And then in the allergen statement, it says contains wheat ingredients. So this is just one example. This is another package of goldfish, which are quite common in a school setting. As you can see, there's a contains statement and it's right there, the big bolded wheat. So those are very easy to identify. However, if this product contained rye or barley, they would not appear in this location. You would actually have to read through all of the fine print of the ingredients. So as I mentioned, gluten is wheat, rye, and barley, and any derivatives of those ingredients. So here we have other names for wheat. These are on the handout that we have for you on the gluten-free, safe, unsafe, and questionable ingredients. So these are all listed there, so you don't need to be taking notes to get all of these down. Here are other names for barley. Again, these are all on that list. One thing I'm going to point out is malt, because malt is most often a sweetener made from barley. However, you can malt any grain. So there are some instances in which a malted ingredient could be safe. However, it must say gluten-free malt. If it does not say that the grain malted is gluten-free, you should assume that it's barley and that it is unsafe for the gluten-free diet. So why is this really important? because of Rice Krispies. Rice Krispies are one of the most common things that we see in childhood, in Rice Krispie treats, in cereal that they eat, in snack mixes. And as you can see on the label here, it contains malt flavor. In this case, it is made from barley and it is unsafe for children with celiac disease. So even though it's a rice cereal, the sugar in it, or the sweetener, is made from barley, so therefore unsafe. Oats are another really common thing that we have controversy over in the gluten-free community. So oats in their natural form are actually gluten-free, and they're used in things like oatmeal, snack bars, granola, veggie burgers, cookies, muffins, breads, and lots of other things. The problem with oats is that, first and foremost, some people with celiac disease cross-react to the protein in oats. They're very similar in structure, and some people with celiac disease just can't tolerate them. However, the only oats that are ever safe for a person with celiac disease is those that are certified as gluten-free. If the product doesn't say gluten-free, do not feed them to a child with celiac disease. Why? Because of cross-contamination. As you can see in the center here, oats are typically grown in the same fields or adjacent to wheat and barley fields. And unfortunately, they are contaminated. The wind blows and they cross each other. They're in shared trucks and trains and tankers, and unfortunately they are cross-contaminated. So unless the oats come from a dedicated field or have been manufactured in a way that makes them free of gluten, they are unsafe. So if you're using an oat product, it must say gluten-free for a child with celiac disease. Now, there are lots of other sources of gluten, things like Play-Doh, hand sanitizer, cosmetics, medications, glue, art supplies, shampoo, and dog treats, to name a few. As you can see on this very popular brand of hand sanitizer, it actually contains wheat extract. So there are lots of places that you'll find wheat in other products. The good news, though, is that there is no evidence that gluten is absorbed through the skin. It is believed that the protein is too large to go through the barrier. So as long as a child or anyone with celiac disease is not eating the gluten, so we hope that you are not eating Play-Doh or art supplies, it is safe to touch them. But when it comes to something like hand sanitizer, you don't want somebody or child rubbing hand sanitizer on their hands and then that has wheat in it and then going and eating, because there's a chance that the gluten could come off their hands onto the food and then get into their mouth. So it's best for them not to use these things. So gluten-free labels. It's important to know that there are no national gluten-free certifications. Companies can choose to use the term gluten-free however they want on their package, as long as they meet the FDA labeling law of less than 20 parts per million. So you will see lots of different certification stamps out there. None of them are better than the other, as long as they meet the FDA standard of less than 20 parts per million. So here are a lot of safe gluten-free ingredients. Again, this is on the handout, so I'm not going to go through each of them. So where is gluten found in schools? There's lots of places. So sensory tables that use gluten-containing grains and pasta, in art classes, in the crafts, in Play-Doh, in paper mache, in different science projects that use gluten as an ingredient, in cooking classes and home economics or family and consumer science classrooms. Gluten is in lots of the ingredients that are used. And then of course there's cross contact with dirty utensils and workspaces. And of course, special celebrations and festivals. As you know, if food isn't allowed in your learning environment, food is used in special celebrations and activities. It is almost always an occurrence that gluten will show up in these places. So you'll definitely need to plan ahead for these activities so that kids with celiac can participate. And of course, there is gluten in school cafeterias, on the hot and cold buffet bars. There are non-labeled ingredients like gravies, marinades, and salad dressing, shared utensils that contaminate items that are gluten-free. At the tables, student eating sandwiches or other gluten-containing items have crumbs that get left behind. And then in food preparation spaces. So there are lots of places that gluten can come up in school cafeterias. So I want to go back to the classrooms and where we find gluten and talk about, is there a real risk of exposure in the classroom, and look at what the data says. So these pictures are from a study that we did over the last year at our hospital in Washington, D.C. So we enrolled 30 healthy children from the ages of 2 to 18 in our study. They had a median age of 8. We tested several different school scenarios, including playing with Play-Doh, a home economics baking project. We looked at paper mache, and then dry pasta and cooked pasta in sensory tables. So let's look at Play-Doh first. We had the kids play with a 3-ounce container of Play-Doh for 5 minutes. We then rubbed slices of gluten-free breads on their hands and separated on the table in front of them. We chose to rub gluten-free bread on their hands and on the tables so that we could measure how much gluten would be possible for them to eat if they ate right after. Then we looked at hand washing. So we had them play with the Play-Doh again, and then we randomly assigned them a washing method, either soap and water, water alone, or a wet wipe. And then we again rubbed bread on their hands. Then we tested the entire slices of bread for gluten. And we also looked at how much gluten was in an entire container of Play-Doh, just in case the child accidentally ate the entire tub of Play-Doh or a portion of it. We wanted to know how much was there. So how much gluten is in a 3-ounce container of Play-Doh, which is that little yellow tub you see? 32,253 parts per million. That is a lot. And if you remember, the safe level is less than 20 parts per million. So there is a lot of gluten in a tub of Play-Doh. No one should eat Play-Doh, but a child with celiac disease should really never eat Play-Doh. But these are the results after we rubbed the bread, the gluten-free bread, on their hands after playing with Play-Doh. As you can see, the dark black line is transfer from the hands, and you can see none of them crossed that 20 parts per million red line threshold. We did have 2 that crossed the threshold from the table. However, both of those samples had visible pea-sized pieces of Play-Doh adhered to the bread. So the moral of the story here is that if you can see the Play-Doh, don't eat it. But if you could not see it on the bread, then there's not enough there to cause a problem. The really good news, though, is that after washing, you can see there's no gluten detected. All were less than 5 parts per million, whether it was water alone, soap and water, or wet wipe. So the moral of the story is that if a child with celiac disease uses Play-Doh, they should then wash their hands and the table should be cleaned. And then there's no risk of exposure to gluten. And of course, they should not eat the Play-Doh itself. All right, so a home economics project. We had our kids roll out wheat-based cookie dough using a rolling pin on a table dusted with wheat flour. They then cut out the dough with cookie cutters and transferred them to baking sheets and placed them in the oven. We did the exact same methodology of rubbing the gluten-free bread on their hands and the tables, and then the same hand washing scenario. And then, of course, we tested the whole slices again. This is just some pictures of what the activity looked like. As you can see, there was quite a range of how much flour was on their hands after making the cookies. So it was interesting to see the results. But as you can see here, all of them, 100%, were above that red gluten-free threshold line of 20 parts per million from both the hands and the table. So this was definitely a problem. And a child with celiac disease probably should not be using gluten-containing flour in a baking environment. Now, then what happened with washing? So as you can see, the washing was effective at removing the gluten from the hands of children. However, it was not so effective from being removed from the tables. And actually, the adults were the one washing the tables. So water alone was not effective, but soap and water and wet wipes were very effective at removing the gluten. However, since there were still low-level readings, even after washing, the best recommendation is that for a child with celiac disease, they should be using gluten-free materials in a baking classroom. Now, this is not as difficult as it sounds. There are lots of different brands of gluten-free all-purpose flours that can be used in baking. There are even gluten-free cookie doughs that are pre-made. There's gluten-free pasta and breadcrumbs and just so many wonderful gluten-free options that it is still very possible for a child with celiac disease to participate in these activities. So paper mache looked very similar to baking in that participants were doing a very messy project. So they used newspaper and the adhesive made from wheat flour to create a balloon bowl. The strips of newspaper were dipped into the paper mache and then wrapped around one end of the balloon. And then we told the kids to let their hands dry. Once they were dry, we again rubbed the slice of bread on their hands and then we tested it for gluten. So as you can imagine, the levels were incredibly high, ranging from 154 parts per million all the way up to 13,000. So this was a very unsafe activity for the children, just like the baking. But again, paper mache can easily be made from rice flour or cornstarch, and then it's perfectly gluten-free, and the whole class could use the same gluten-free paper mache. So then we tested dry pasta in sensory tables, and we had a very similar scenario. They played with it in the table. We rubbed the gluten-free bread on their hands. We did the same thing with cooked pasta in a sensory table. So the only difference was that it was cooked instead of dry. And then we rubbed the bread on their hands. So these are pictures of both scenarios. On top, you see the wet cooked pasta, and on the bottom you see the dry pasta. Obviously the cooked pasta was very sticky and clung to their hands, but the interesting thing to definitely look at here is that on the left hand side you see the child with very little on his hands. This child felt that it felt like worms and he was not very interested in playing with it, whereas on the right this child thought it was really fun squishing it and had it all over. So as you can imagine, the levels were quite different. The cooked pasta is in the green and the purple is the dry pasta. There was no risk at using the dry pasta, all the levels well below 20 parts per million. And as you can see with the cooked pasta, they were all well above, except for participant number 9. That was the child who thought it felt like worms. So the moral of the story is that the way in which they engage with the material definitely makes a difference. But for materials that are sticky, like paper mache, the cooked wet pasta, the cookie dough, those things stick and are harder to get rid of. So in those scenarios, the children really should be using a gluten-free material. But for the dry items like pasta and Play-Doh, there was not much of a risk, and those would be okay so long as the children wash their hands after and they do not consume the materials themselves. So what are our conclusions based on this data? That cross-contact with gluten could occur more often with the use of some school supplies than others. Play-Doh and dry pasta don't pose as high of a risk for cross-contact, so we should consider allowing children with celiac disease to use these materials as long as they do not eat them directly, and of course they wash their hands afterwards. And you can apply this rule to other dry, non-sticky materials as well. However, for home economics baking projects, paper mache and cooked pasta, use gluten-free materials only for students with celiac disease, and the same goes for other materials that are wet or sticky. And of course, cross-contact can be reduced in all of these scenarios by washing hands and work surfaces regularly with soap and water or other approved cleaning solutions. So now let's go to talk about laws that govern celiac disease. There are federal laws and regulations. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, most often referred to as the ADA. This law defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. In regards to celiac disease, eating and major bodily functions, among them the digestive and immune systems, are included. So therefore, celiac disease does qualify for protection under this law. Next is Section 504A of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which, as you all know, prohibits discrimination in all institutions receiving federal financial assistance, which includes schools, on the basis of disability. This requires institutions to provide educational programming that is designed to meet the students' individual educational needs as adequately as the needs of non-disabled students are met. So it requires reasonable accommodation without drastically altering the structure of the educational institution. So now there is a child with celiac disease at my school. Now what? So there are lots of action lists attached to this presentation. There are action lists for teachers, administrators and principals, nurses, psychologists, and counselors. And these lists have great information about what you should be doing every day. I encourage you to take a look at them, and if you have questions, to please reach out to us. But most importantly, they help you provide a supportive and inclusive learning environment for students with celiac disease. And this includes providing access to gluten-free food and supplies for all learning activities. And if the supplies are not gluten-free, access to appropriate washing. Providing access to bathrooms as needed, to school health personnel if symptoms are occurring. Always provide access to hand washing with soap and water before eating, to clean tables and desks for eatings with approved cleaning solutions, and safe participation in all school-sponsored learning and social activities. These are some very basic things that will make a huge difference for a child with celiac disease. But I also want to take a moment to talk about you being confident in your knowledge. For a parent of a child with celiac disease, there is nothing better than knowing that that child is safe when they're out of their hands. So when you find out that there's a child in your school that has celiac disease, tell those parents that you have been trained and that you are committed to a safe and inclusive school year. Stay in touch with the family so that they know that you're on top of it. And as we all know, a little bit of TLC goes a really, really long way to helping the parents feel happy and that their child is in good hands. And of course, you always have this presentation to refer back to and access to contact us at Children's National. So I want to talk about a few other ways that you can support children with celiac disease. So section 2 of the recommendations talk about teaching children about chronic diseases like celiac disease. So things like understanding that some children are unable to tolerate certain foods, just like kids with nut allergies or dairy allergies. Why it's wrong to bully or tease others who are managing a special diet. How and why to find a teacher or other supervising adult who can help respond with a child with celiac disease or any other chronic disease is feeling ill. And understanding why it's important to only touch or eat one's own food during meals and snack times. These are all really basic lessons that are really good for every child to learn. So then section 2B talks about teaching parents and families about celiac disease. So this is this is for all parents. So it's really great for families to learn how an institution is preventing gluten exposure for children with celiac disease. And this can go far beyond celiac disease. It is good for families to know how the school or whatever the institution is handling food allergies. It is good for them to know how they are keeping kids healthy at school. It is good for parents to know how to build an inclusive community for all children with celiac disease, but not just celiac disease, other food sensitivities, allergies, or other chronic conditions. We want to make sure that regardless of the condition, that all kids are being included. And it is great for families to know about policies and protocols to prevent bullying and teasing of students with special dietary needs or any special needs in general. So what are these parents of kids with celiac disease going to ask you for? Section 3 of the recommendations offers recommended practices for accommodating children with celiac disease in different learning environments. These accommodations should be documented in the individual 504 plan or whatever plan is developed by your institution. But it is really important to note that not every recommendation is going to apply to every child or every institutional setting. This is a very broad and large list, and not every single one is going to be relevant. So you can see this in the Celiac Disease Management Plan handout. You have the full table of recommendations, but rarely, and I can't think of a single time that we have ever created a plan that had all of them. So don't worry, you're not going to get all of these. So in regards to cleaning, there are many references in the document to clean things. So what do we recommend? We recommend following cleaning policies and procedures to prevent gluten from contacting gluten-free foods and materials. And every state has different laws, and every district has different laws and different cleaning solutions. So start by researching what it is that you're required to do in your district. When it comes to washing hands for kids, you should always let them wash with soap and water. So what should you do in the event of a gluten exposure? These gluten exposures may or may not have occurred in your environment. So a child may have had something for dinner the night before and may not be having a reaction until the next morning or afternoon. So it might not have happened on your turf, but you still have to handle it. So you should notify parents and guardians of the suspected exposure as soon as you become aware of it. You should provide unrestricted access to the bathroom facility and health or counseling staff for the child. And you should seek further medical attention if the student, if they vomit continuously, they appear to be severely dehydrated, they report severe abdominal pain or distension, or they report symptoms that are not typical of their normal gluten reaction. And then afterwards, a staff member should review the exposure and the response to that exposure with the parent or guardian so that they can develop a strategy to prevent it from happening again in the future. So now I just want to show you a sample plan. So we talked about Brandon earlier and his experience with getting diagnosed. So this is Brandon's 504 plan that was put together for kindergarten this year. So the plan is fairly standard for what this school district required. There was the purpose the plan, there was an overview of his diagnosis and what the treatment is and what he needs. And then it goes into the requested accommodations. So as you can see, there are some of the points that are in the full table that you have as well, but not all of them. Some of the things are that for example, there should be a gluten-free option for Brandon for school-sponsored events that involve food. That's a pretty simple one. The parents ask the school to consider non-food incentives for prizes, gifts, and awards. And this is actually a great thing. And lots of school districts around the country are moving this direction. In regards to snacks, Brandon's parents will provide a gluten-free snack and treat item to be stored in the classroom or other agreed upon storage space in the event of an unexpected activity that involves food. So these are very basic things. They say, please don't serve Brandon food unless it has a gluten-free label. If they're going on a field trip, engage Brandon's parents in planning for accommodations for offsite activities. If food is going to be provided by an outside vendor, the vendor should let them know what they're going to feed him so that they feel safe about that food. So none of these things are really crazy things. They're just very basic and reasonable. So then under the plan for an exposure, which should always be in the accommodation plan, Brandon will not experience life-threatening symptoms such as anaphylaxis. But as we talked about earlier in the diagnosis, he may experience diarrhea and vomiting. So it's important to help him deal with those symptoms and then to contact his parents. We also have families send copies of the safe and unsafe and questionable foods list, tips for school cafeterias, preventing cross contact, the flour guide, and then some of Brandon's favorite foods for the school cafeteria. And all of these handouts are again available to you to download as part of the presentation. So let's just talk about some general simple classroom accommodations. In sensory tables, consider rice or corn, beans, or gluten-free pasta as gluten-free ingredients. In art classes, you can always use gluten-free pasta or naturally gluten-free grains like rice, quinoa, corn, or beans. For Play-Doh, there are alternatives. Crayola has a naturally gluten-free Play-Doh. Or of course, you can always make homemade Play-Doh from rice flour and cornstarch. And as I mentioned before, you can make paper mache from rice flour or cornstarch. There are lots of awesome naturally gluten-free science projects like growing rock candy crystals, emulsifying oil and vinegar, making your own bubbly water, making butter. There are just so many things. In cooking classes, try naturally gluten-free recipes or try using a gluten-free all-purpose flour for all the kids to use. And then, of course, our celiac disease program is here for you. We have lots of materials and educational documents for schools and families. You can download all of these from childrensnational.org/celiac. We are happy to participate in individual 504 plan meetings and advocacy efforts, whether it's on behalf of the family or on behalf of the school. We are happy to be there to help get to those reasonable accommodations. And you can schedule these meetings by emailing us at celiac@childrensnational.org. And just like we're doing today, we have web-based trainings for schools, food service providers, and other learning environments. Today's seminar was not geared towards food service providers, so we did not go through very specific preventing cross-contact measures in the kitchen, but we are happy to do that for those who are involved in the actual preparation of food. So I want to again thank you for your time today. We are happy to answer questions now, or you can also email us at any time. Our emails are up on the screen: vweisbro@childrensnational.org or bkersner@childrensnational.org, and we are here for you. So please feel free to reach out anytime, and our program looks forward to working with you.